Do you remember what your parents told you about saving money? They said it was safe. They said it was the foundation of your future. But what if the very institution responsible for protecting that money has been systematically destroying its value for decades? What if your current financial reality, the crushing cost of a home, the anxiety of grocery prices, the sinking feeling that you were running faster just to stay in the same place, is not an accident? It's not simply inflation. It is a deliberate, historical pattern of economic decay, one that America's $34 trillion debt has now made undeniable. The lesson is not new. 2,000 years ago, an empire that thought itself eternal discovered that the real barbarian at the gate was the one in the treasury. We are living through the modern version of the fall of Rome, and we need to talk about the collapse of confidence that is already underway. When people think about the fall of the Roman Empire, they always picture the obvious: the Visigoths at the gates, the corrupt senators, the emperors poisoned in marble baths. But empires don't crumble just from external attack. They rot from within, and one of the most corrosive, most reliable forces of internal rot is always a broken financial system. Rome didn't just fall because of invasions, it fell because its currency collapsed. For centuries, the backbone of Rome's economic power, the very thing that paid its legions, built its roads, and funded its civilization, was the silver denarius. When it was first minted, it was nearly pure silver, a symbol of trust, confidence, and real value. As long as people believed in Rome, they believed in its money. This coin was the anchor of the known world. Soldiers accepted it as pay, merchants demanded it in trade, and ordinary families stored their wealth in it for their retirement. The denarius was confidence, stamped into metal, but running an empire is expensive. By the 2nd century after Christ, Rome was stretched thin, defending vast borders, fighting wars, and funding massive public works. Tax revenues, which rely on a functioning, trusting economy, simply could not keep pace with the enormous military costs. The emperors were faced with a dilemma. They could openly tax their citizens more, which is politically suicidal. Or they could use the old hidden trick, the silent tax that governments have used for millennia: debasement. Instead of openly raising taxes, they secretly started reducing the silver content in the denarius. The coin looked the same on the surface, but the value, the real value, was being systematically hollowed out. The numbers are terrifying because they chart a roadmap for collapse. Under Augustus, the denarius contained about 95% pure silver. By the reign of Caracalla, it had been cut down to around 50%. The empire was literally printing money by mixing cheap copper into the silver. And by the time of Emperor Gallienus in the mid-3rd century, that once pure coin contained less than 5% silver. It was a copper disc coated with a thin, brittle silver wash. A counterfeit passed off as real money. The consequences were devastating, and they were not abstract. They destroyed the lives of ordinary Romans. The value of their savings evaporated overnight. Prices for basic necessities, like a measure of wheat, skyrocketed, demanding dozens of the debased denarii where once only one was needed. This led to runaway inflation. This is the exact blueprint for how empires die, and it is the precise blueprint America's policymakers are following right now. The difference is that today the silver has been replaced by the promise of paper, and the debasement is not done with copper, but with the $34 trillion in debt that is already haunting your future. Let's contextualize this for the modern English-speaking world. The United States, the self-proclaimed New Rome, has enjoyed an extraordinary economic privilege for 80 years. The dollar has been the world's reserve currency. After World War II, at the Bretton Woods Conference, the United States, which held 2/3 of the world's gold, set the rules. The dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. The world rested on the promise that America would maintain financial discipline. This was America's strategic advantage, its ultimate geopolitical weapon. It meant America could finance wars, build domestic programs, and run deficits without immediately suffering the consequences that other nations face. The world would absorb that debt, believing in the U.S. promise. But by the 1960s, the cost of the Vietnam War and massive domestic spending programs pushed the U.S. to print more dollars than it had gold to back up. Foreign governments noticed this lack of discipline, and they began demanding gold in exchange for the paper dollars they held. This created a run on America's gold reserves. In 1971, President Richard Nixon slammed the door shut, ending the dollar's direct link to gold. This moment, the Nixon Shock, was the quiet revolution that fundamentally changed the world's financial system. Debt became untethered. The denarius was officially replaced by an IOU with no metal backing. Governments could now borrow and print money at will, limited only by one thing: global trust. This quiet revolution transformed debt from a finite problem, limited by real assets, into an infinite possibility. The last 5 decades have seen a relentless escalation. Every successive administration has expanded public debt, justifying it as necessary for defense, economic stimulus, or reform. The United States, as the global reserve issuer, became the primary architect of this new debt-fueled world. The nation used its unique power to wage global conflicts, from the Cold War to the Middle East, by issuing bonds that the world had to buy. While this strategy contained geopolitical rivals, it simultaneously enslaved future generations of American citizens. The cost of financing the empire is no longer paid for by silver, but by the rapidly diminishing purchasing power of every American dollar you hold. Every dollar borrowed is a claim on tomorrow's work, and when the numbers hit $34 trillion, repayment becomes impossible. The empire is now structurally dependent on the world believing in the counterfeit promise, just as the late Roman Empire depended on the hope that its silver-washed copper coin would still buy bread. This debt is dressed up in the language of economic growth or stimulus, but it is a massive generational wealth transfer system dressed up as national finance. When the government issues bonds to finance its $34 trillion deficit, it is quietly building a tab in your name, which you will eventually pay through eroded savings and higher prices. The wealthy, the banks and foreign powers buy the bonds and earn secure interest, while ordinary people pay higher taxes or pay through inflation to fund those very interest payments. This is the unseen structural debt that mirrors the late Roman system. The illusion is the only thing that has changed. The historical pattern demands that we recognize the fragility of this modern denarius. The time for recognizing this trap is running out. This is the moment to stop asking if the mountain of debt will cause a crisis and start asking when and who will pay the final price when the system resets. We have established the historical blueprint. Now we must analyze the consequence, the enormous structural crisis generated by the $34 trillion debt. This number is not just a figure. It represents the largest, most audacious financial manipulation in global history, disguised as responsible governance. The political strategy behind this immense borrowing has been to project American power globally. The U.S. has used its exorbitant privilege, the ability to borrow in its own currency, to finance a world order that benefits itself. By exporting dollars for goods, America received real products, and the rest of the world received the debt and the inflation that followed. But this strategy has reached its structural limits. The scale of the debt now generates a massive internal crisis that threatens the very core of the American economy. The debt is no longer just a foreign policy tool. It is a domestic liability. The interest payments on the $34 trillion debt have become one of the largest budget items, consuming hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars every year, money that could have been used for infrastructure, education, or innovation. Instead, that money flows directly to bondholders, transferring wealth from the taxpayer to the creditor. The US government is now paying its debts by issuing more debt, trapped in a self-feeding spiral of leverage. The political system is now deeply entrenched in this debt-driven ideology. Both major parties are structurally incapable of stopping the spending. Any politician who advocates for fiscal discipline, meaning massive cuts to popular spending or painful tax hikes, is instantly marginalized. This creates a political incentive structure where the only viable path is to kick the fiscal can down the road, increasing the debt load and hoping the system holds up until the next election cycle. This is the definition of imperial decadence, prioritizing short-term political expediency over the long-term structural health of the nation. The Roman emperors, who debased the denarius, also prioritized short-term military payments and political popularity over the long-term stability of their currency. They, too, were structurally incapable of making the hard choices. This is the great deception of modern economic policy. When you see inflation, the rising cost of fuel, the shrinking size of a grocery package, you're not just witnessing bad luck or temporary supply chain issues. You are witnessing the political and economic policy of inflating away the $34 trillion debt. Inflation is the modern debasement of the coin. It reduces the real value of the government's debts, which is politically convenient for the elite. But for citizens, it erodes financial freedom and steals wealth. It is the silent, hidden tax that has broken every empire for 2,000 years. We stand at the precipice of a historical reset, one that will not be marked by barbarians at the gates, but by the slow, inexorable evaporation of trust in the paper promises of the state. The power of the US dollar rests entirely on the global belief in its value and the reliability of the United States government as a steward of that value. This is the essential lesson of Roman Denarius. Once people lose faith in the money, the empire's power dissolves. Today, we see cracks in that confidence. Central banks of rival nations are quietly reducing their reliance on the dollar and accumulating physical assets like gold.